Welcome to this online course of See for Yourself, which is all about uncovering Christianity. I'm assuming that you're here because you want to know more about the Christian faith, more about Jesus Christ, and what it means to be a Christian. That's great. I'm going to try and lead us through 4 sessions with that aim in mind. We're going to be working our way through the Gospel of Mark. If you have access to a Bible, Mark is the second book in the New Testament. That's the second half of the Bible. There are plenty of English translations, but we'll be using the New International Version. Or you can always access the online version, and I'd recommend uncover.org.uk. You could read Mark's Gospel there. And also because that website has lots of other helpful information too. Why Mark's Gospel? Well, it's one of the 4 eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. It's also the shortest of the 4 Gospels, so we can complete reading it fairly swiftly. And it's based on the eyewitness accounts of Peter, one of Jesus' main followers. If you want to know more about the reliability of Mark, then see the Uncover video and resources on that website. So in this first session, we're going to be asking, who is Jesus? Look how the Gospel begins. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. The word Gospel means good news, and Mark tells us that the good news here is about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Let's just pause there to think about this title, Son of God. When the Bible talks about God, it's describing a person, a personal, powerful creator. And it takes us right back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, which begins with the opening lines. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the universe. And God created all things, including plants and animals and human beings, in his likeness. And that's why Mark announces his gospel as good news. The Son of God has appeared and entered our world. But now he has to make his case. So he builds up a picture of Jesus as someone with great authority or power. We see his power as a teacher in chapter 1, verse 21 to 22. When he's teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum, notice in verse 22 the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. The interesting thing here is that religious teachers often quoted from other authorities to add weight to their own teaching. But Jesus didn't do that. He speaks on his own authority, and the crowds recognize the power of his words. We see his power over evil spirits. In chapter 1, verses 23 to 28, Jesus casts out a demon, an impure or evil spirit. And notice how the people react in verse 26. What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him. The Bible recognizes the reality of a supernatural world made up of good and evil spirits. But it's interesting to notice here that the evil spirits recognize Jesus. They recognize who he is, and they recognize his power over them. And then we see Jesus' power over sickness. In chapter 1, verse 29 to 33, Jesus starts healing people. And you'll notice that after sunset, it says in verse 32, people brought to Jesus all who were ill and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. Notice that not only does Jesus heal with a touch, but also heals all who approach him, all who were ill or who had various diseases. And these healings were constant and well publicized. Jesus is using his power for good. And then we see Jesus' power to forgive sins. In Mark chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, we read the account of a paralyzed man who is brought to Jesus. And Jesus says to him, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now the religious leaders don't like that. They think to themselves, why does he talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And in the conversation afterwards, Jesus reveals that he knows what they're thinking. And then he says, which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And so he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home. He got up, took his mat and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. In one sense, the religious leaders were right. No one can forgive sins except God alone. So what's the answer to Jesus' question? Which is easier? It seems that Jesus performs this miracle because he wants to provide proof that he has the power to forgive sins. Then we can see Jesus' power over nature. In Mark chapter 4, 35 to 41, we read about this storm that breaks over the boat, and the disciples and Jesus are nearly swamped by it. But Jesus is sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples wake him up. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? And Jesus gets up, he rebukes the wind and the waves. Quiet, be still, he says, and the wind dies down, and it's completely calm. And they are terrified. They ask each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. It's interesting to note that Jesus here rebukes the storm in the same way he rebukes the demons. He's in charge of nature. In the Old Testament, the Bible describes God being able to do this. In Psalm 107, it says, he stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. And notice the response of the disciples. They were afraid of drowning, but now they are terrified of Jesus. Who is this? They ask. And that's a key question. And then we see Jesus' power over life and death. In chapter 5, verse 35 to 42, we read of a man called Jairus, a synagogue ruler whose daughter is ill. He comes to plead with Jesus, asking him to come and heal her. And then he hears some terrible news. Your daughter is dead, they say. Why bother the teacher anymore? But Jesus overhears them and he says to Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. And when he gets to the house, there's a whole lot of commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. And he goes in and he says, why all this commotion and wailing? The child isn't dead, but asleep. But they laugh at him. He puts everyone out apart from the child's parents and some of the disciples. And he takes the child by the hand and he says to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stands up and begins to walk around. She's 12 years old. At this they're completely astonished. And Jesus gives strict orders not to tell anyone about this and to give her something to eat. She really is alive. Now it's difficult to imagine how Jairus felt when he heard that news about his daughter's death. but Jesus tells him to believe. The crowd of mourners laugh at Jesus because they all know that she is dead. But to Jesus, death is like sleep. He has the power to raise her from the dead with a simple command. There's no hocus pocus or mumbo jumbo, just a word. And by his power, she comes back to life. And then we see Jesus' power over people. In chapter 1, verses 16 to 20, we read of the way Jesus calls his disciples, Simon and Andrew, and then James and John. They're all fishermen working in their fishing business on the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus says, "Come, follow me." And they follow him. They leave their business and they become his disciples. And they do so gladly and willingly. It's interesting that in those days, disciples usually chose their rabbis, but here Jesus chooses his disciples. He assumes to have a power, an authority, a right to do so. So what's the conclusion? Who is Jesus? Well, Mark is claiming that he is the Son of God. That's the natural conclusion. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, can do what only God can do. He's the Son of God, which means he displays to us the power of God, and he reveals to us the person of God, what God is really like. And if God is like Jesus, then that really is good news. So this is the first leg of the three-legged stool to picture the Christian faith. The first leg is that Jesus is the Son of God. And now here's some homework. Before the next session, please read the first 5 chapters of Mark's Gospel and note down any questions or points of interest that strike you. I'm sure you do have questions, and it would be a good idea to put them to the Christian who pointed you towards this course. Or you can always send in any questions you have by email. Mark it C for yourself and send it in to emmanuel.lefwich@gmail.com, and we'll try and pick them up and respond to them when we can. The important thing is, don't be afraid to ask questions. However basic you may feel they are, we've all had to start somewhere. So thanks for joining us for the first session of See for Yourself, and you're very welcome to join me again for session 2.